We have a number of folks that join us, of course, online. It is a vital part of our ministry as well as in person, and just an apology to that community. We are having some problems with our internet system, so appreciation to KOA for all that he's doing to rectify that, and thanks for your patience, folks that are taking the service in on. There's a number of folks there as well, so we are aware and sensitive to that and apologize for that, doing all of our best. Let us all pray. Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever and always acceptable unto you. For you are our rock and our Redeemer, our Alpha and our Omega, our beginning and our end, the source of our love, and a wellspring of our joys. Amen. I don't know all that many that are great at reading the fine print of these things that we get involved with. I was delighted when I was holidaying with family in Mexico and I received a free trip, an afternoon cruise in the harbor. The only thing I needed to do for the afternoon cruise was attend a seminar. It was a timeshare that was being created, and then when it went on to 2 and 3 hours, I realized that I wished I had read the fine print. I signed up for a book club years ago. I was delighted to receive some books coming to my mailbox, and then months dragged on, and I was really upset with all of these books that I had no desire to have in my library. You might have your own stories of record clubs, tape clubs, all of these things that we didn't read the fine print, and we wondered how we ever got part of this. We wish we're better at reading the fine print. Have you ever read the fine print on what it costs to be a Christian? Have you ever thought about what it means to be a card-carrying, not that we have a card, but a Christian? What does that mean? What does it require of you? What does the Lord require of you? We sang that song a little earlier. What's the fine print of the Christian life? Well, you might be quick and maybe even a little cheeky and say, I can give you a long list of things I do for my church. I can give you a of all of the hours that I give to my church. I can give you a list of all of the financial contributions that I give to my list to the church, and the list would go on and on, perhaps. And those are significant and very important. Our hard-earned money, important. Our very valuable time, very significant offerings we give. But I must tell you, and maybe you already know, the call, the Christian, the fine print is much more significant and a very demanding call upon our lives, more than just time and more than just money. Charles Swindoll is an author, a speaker that you may have come across over the years, and he was lambasted in a book a while back called Grace Awakening. He assigned God's grace to everyone. Some of the critics of his book said that he was just far too laissez-faire in saying that everyone receives God's grace. Everyone is loved and welcomed by God. The prescription, if you would, that he offers of grace is that it is a free gift. God's grace is given freely and lovingly to each and every person. I wonder what you think. Does God freely give this gift of grace, this gift of being part of God's family freely and wonderfully? Are there some catches, some fine print that we need to be aware of that we should share with others as well? What is the responsibility of the card-carrying Christian in our living, in our loving, and in our serving? What do we think about that? Do we receive salvation just by the nature of our very birth? God's love, pouring down upon us because we were born? Or is it a result of the way we live? The way we serve, that God's grace, our salvation, our connection with God comes as a result of the way we live out our lives. How is it that we connect with God? Faith, or is it about the works and the things that we do? I think this dilemma becomes rather apparent as we think about one of the happening contexts today that I wanted to talk about as well, Homelessness Awareness Week, that we're about a month away from. We're going to see lots of opportunities to learn more about the unhoused in our community and across our country over the coming months. And I think I'd like to suggest that this has a real bearing on the text that Kathleen read for us today. I know many of you have participated in the homeless count over the years. You've gone out into various communities and been involved in the homeless count. Many of you have rolled up your sleeves and have been involved in serving food to people that are in need of food, more recently at Cloverdale Community Kitchen, in the past, the hot lunch, in all of the varied ways that we've served those folks in need. And many of you donate to our food pantry here, to the Surrey Food Bank. So there is a deep awareness and a deep care for folks that are in need and are hungry. It's interesting, in the last little while, we've been seeing more and more awareness. Our government has become aware, and campaigns like this have been supported. It's really about the last almost half century that we're seeing more and more awareness. And in the last 30 years or so, a lot of deep dive and researchers doing work around helping us understand homelessness and where the patterns are throughout North America. Now, we'd certainly like to assign benevolence to our government, just a deep care and love to all, but we also know that, of course, there's a big fiscal cost attached for folks that are living on the streets and in and out of shelters, hospitals, and the government's need to sort that all out. A couple of the areas that I found fascinating that I just wanted to highlight, very surprising when we think of the typical person that might be unhoused, it's really only a very small percentage. About 10% of the population that we would think of as homeless, those folks living on the street, perhaps mental illness, drug, alcohol addictions, in and out of shelters, living under the eaves and things like that. That's a very small percentage, they're telling us now, researchers, about the unhoused population. What they tell us is that about 80% of the unhoused population are not chronically homeless. The large percentage, about 80%, are not chronically homeless, but rather they're victims of the system. Victims of the system and caught sometimes in between. They might be people that have been evicted from their apartment and they're looking quickly for a new place to live. They might be people that have been suffering a fire in their residence and they need a new place to live after a fire. People that are fleeing abusive situations and they're looking for a new place to live as well. 80%, that large percentage, are victims of the system in ways that we don't have availability for them. And finally, the last 10% won't surprise you. It kind of happens around this time of year when the temperatures get cooler and the rains come more and more. It's the cold and wet weather shelters are opening up, so those are the folks that are accessing those shelters at this time of year. What the researchers are encouraging us to think about is that we should move away from trying to manage this as a problem and actually move into solving the problem. One of the areas that I found fascinating in the research is they're encouraging us to think about the language we use. And I'm kind of using two languages here. One area they're encouraging us to think about is moving away from the word homeless and to think about using the word unhoused. What they're encouraging us to think about with unhoused is thinking about those are the folks that are part of the issue that where we might be all part of the solution. It's not their fault necessarily. It's our fault as a society, and we come together and we help together to find a solution for this issue. If someone is homeless, it's their problem. We kind of point the finger more directly at people. So the encouragement in the literature lately has been really thinking about folks as our collective responsibility, the unhoused, and how we will find housing for each and every person. So I wonder how you feel about this issue. I know it's something that we're confronted with each and every day. Many times I arrive at the church and we are unhoused that have found a place to sleep, and we find them some food, and we wish there was more to do. We worry about the system, we worry about folks on the streets, and we wonder how we might deal with it. How do you feel? Is it an area that deeply troubles you? Is it an area that we turn a blind eye to? Is it an area that we vote with, that we think about as a voting area that's a responsibility? It's a complex one indeed. What I'd like to suggest in this issue, is that our faith story, the two texts that Kathleen read for us this morning, offer some insight into how we might consider this issue in society. Those texts are a call towards humility, the humble Christian unhoused. Now, the first text that Kathleen read comes from one of the letters that Paul writes to the early church. He wrote many. He was kind of the early bishop, if you will. They start at the letter to the church in Rome, and it continues on, and here we are in the letter to the Hebrews. The question threaded through most of Paul's letters is that dilemma. Are we connected with God through faith, or are we deeply connected with God through the work we do? Is the connection with God about work or faith? The faith versus works dilemma. And Paul is addressing that throughout many of his letters. Paul deals with this in the letter to Hebrews. We hear about this perfection of Christ as the humble high priest, his way of service. He did not seek glory. His humility, his faith, his obedience, his suffering, all of these ways that Christ is identified as living by Paul is that which makes him perfect. His perfection as the humble priest versus other of the priests that were around in the day, that is what made him perfect. Not necessarily his faith, but his service also was indeed lifted up by Paul. And in the gospel text, when we move into the second reading that Kathleen offered, there is further call for the Christian humility, the Christian, humble Christian in this text as well. If there was ever a conversation, a confusion around our belief in the need to care for others, our need to care for the last and the least, it's cleared up here. James and John, two of the key disciples, they would love to sit at Jesus' side, his left and his right. And Jesus calls them not to that, to a place of humility and to a place of service. Jesus calls them in the text, and he says that their way of humility, this humble way, must be lived out. The greatness will only be achieved through your suffering, sharing in the suffering, sharing in the pain, sharing in the humility that Jesus is. Jesus asks them that challenging question, the same question that we receive as we hear the text. Are you able to drink the cup from which I drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I'll be baptized with? The cup we think about takes us all the way up to the upper room, where Jesus will pass the cup to his disciples. Will they be able to share in the suffering that he will suffer? Will they be able to share in the service that he teaches? We remember he's washed their feet. He's welcomed them as a good host, as a good servant. He passes that cup. In the Jewish tradition, the cup of sacrifice is that same cup that is passed around when they think about the days all the way back in Babylon. It has a deep meaning, the cup of sacrifice. Jesus contrasting, of course, in this text with those leaders who lord over their power over others. Jesus talks about a leadership that is one based in service. He says, whoever wants to be the greatest among you must become the servant. Just take those words in, don't we? Whoever must be the greatest must be the servant. That's just putting everything we think about on its ear, isn't it? Greatness comes from servitude. You must be the first, the slave of all, the Son of Man, the one who serves. We have a very odd convergence, don't we, today? Quite often the teachings in the text are so odd from what is happening in the world. But today, when we think about Homeless Awareness Week coming up, they're almost the same, aren't they? That call to care for the unhoused, that call in the text to be the servant, the one who cares for those who are in need, call to share in the suffering of others, to open the arms of our communities in ways that we haven't yet done, to tear the walls down of division, to find space at the table for the hungry, for the unhoused, for each and every, so that the last will be the first and that we will all be a stronger and richer community together. Now, there is a risk in this conversation about faith and works when we decide which one is more important. There's a real risk, I think, in this one because we become perhaps so focused on doing that we lose track of why we're doing it. Or we become so focused on why we're doing it, the faith, that we don't do it anymore. So there's a real risk when we kind of think of things as an or. I think the best answer, at least I come to it, is that we need both. We need a deep, rich faith that will inform and strengthen the work we do. When we do that incredible work of care and servant, that strengthens our faith. We need both. It's never been an either or. We need a deep, rich faith. We need a call and a ministry to be lived out. They reinforce each other. We become that humble Christian that lives out their faith, a deep, rich, strong faith lived out into the world. I want to close by introducing you to a friend of mine. I want to share a story about an amazing man that I met in my very first ministry in the north in Prince George 25 or so years ago. Cowboy Bob. Cowboy Bob is a retired RCMP constable. And he was probably 20 or so years living his mission of caring for the unhoused. I met Cowboy Bob when he was well into this deep living of his faith. He would spend the evenings going through Needle Row, caring for those who were the drug addicted. He would be speaking with the sex trade workers, knowing each and every one of their names. Cowboy Bob would have held an addict's hand who was preparing to commit suicide and take the knife away from him and take him to get help. Cowboy Bob would be someone that had carried a person that was unhoused and had passed out in a snowbank, carry that person to a warm shelter to get help for the night. Cowboy Bob was an incredible saint that I got to meet. And one day, Cowboy Bob walked into the doors of my church. Cowboy Bob walked in and he said, "Hi, I'm Bob. Long gray hair. You won't be surprised. Big cowboy hat, cowboy boots, and a big smile." Now, Cowboy Bob was worried that the new minister in town would be welcoming to those who were unhoused in the downtown core of Prince George. So I got to know Cowboy Bob and the work that he did and his passionate conviction for those who were living on the street. We developed a Bible study over time. We would have a Bible study with folks that could come. We developed a meal that would happen. There were so many neat things that Bob started to become increasingly involved at the church. And before I moved away to my next church in Burnaby, Cowboy Bob asked me something very special. He asked me if I would baptize him. I was absolutely taken aback. This is someone that had been doing the work for so long, and he had not yet been baptized. I said to him, "Me? Baptize you? I have never met a more committed, active Christian in their faith. With all that you do, Bob, you haven't been baptized yet?" He said, "Sometimes you get so busy doing, you forget why you're doing it." So on Easter Sunday that year, I had the honor and the privilege of baptizing Bob. And as the waters rolled down from his forehead, it was this powerful moment of faith and works intertwined. I realized how they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. The belief system that we hold, the call to live it out, how they are so married together, intertwined. The next year, Bob was named Citizen of the Year. And when I talked to Bob about that, he said, the only title that really matters was his baptism. Amen.